Well, hi, everybody out there. Welcome to this new edition of what we're calling Sacred Conversations. Today, I am really pleased to welcome Paul Verryn to this space, this virtual space. But Paul is coming to us all the way from South Africa today. And I'll say just a little bit more about Paul shortly, but let me start today just by saying that I hope that you're well and I hope that you're hanging in through all of this. Just a few weeks ago, I compared each of these weeks to a rather intense track workout that I used to do, going around a 400-meter loop again and again. And by that count, we're on our fifth lap right now, and there are probably still a good many to go. But I know that we can do this, and we can and we will keep on going for as long as it takes. Now, I can say that for two reasons. First, it's something that I believe our faith has already trained us to do. The writer of the book of Hebrews compares the life of faith to an endurance race, not a sprint, saying, "Let us run with perseverance the race set before us. Lift your drooping hands and strengthen your weak knees," the writer says, "and make straight paths for your feet." Now, I know the way before us may seem long, but we already know how to get through this, and we will. So my first reason for speaking as I do is that the sort of endurance that we're practicing right now has been built into our faith practice all along, which is to say that we have what it takes. But my second reason today has to do with our guest. Some of our partners around the globe have endured far more than we're enduring. Indeed, lots of people have endured far more than anything we could be asked to endure. But they've done so with their dignity and their humanity intact. And I think we need to be reminded of those stories right now. Those stories can help us to understand the depths available to us in a moment like this. But they can also help to link us to a wider global community right now as we reflect upon our common struggles in this moment. As a minister, as a theologian, as a community organizer, Paul Verryn has spent his career walking with people who know how to endure. Paul is a bishop in the Methodist Church in Johannesburg, South Africa. He has worked against the apartheid regime in that country, and he currently resides in Soweto, where he continues to address the profound traumas created by the vast social inequalities that exist in South Africa, inequalities that mirror our own here in this country. Paul is dedicated to the struggle for human rights, however and wherever that struggle manifests. As many of you know, he once housed 3,500 refugees in his church in Johannesburg, a saga that's chronicled in the book Sanctuary. Paul is a longtime partner of our congregation here in Old Lyme. Many of you know him and know him well, and I am really honored to call him a friend. So, Paul, again, welcome to this edition of Sacred Conversations, and thank you for being a part of this today, all the way from South Africa. Why don't we begin by having me ask you, how are things going for you? How are things in South Africa, in your part of the world?
It's a mixed answer. For myself, I have permission to move around as ministers in this country are regarded as essential services. But I suppose, and today has been especially so, the concern about hunger. I can't tell you how many calls I've had from people who are desperate for food. And we seem to be challenged by that more than anything else at the moment. So some of those people have included the refugee community who found themselves living in what we call hijacked buildings in the inner city of town. Some of them are the school teachers from Albert Street because, of course, they haven't been paid now for a month. And their salaries are very low anyway.
Mm.
I don't know whether you'll remember. I spoke to you once about people living in a hostel
Mm.
that I had visited. It must be about 2 years ago now, where in desperation, because they were so hungry, they had been killing cats and dogs and jackals and rats to
Mm.
be able to eat.
Mm.
They have phoned me in a desperate state.
Wow. Wow.
And then individuals, that I know are financially compromised.
Right. Right. So as I understand it, there are very few known cases of coronavirus in South Africa right now, and whether or not that has to do with testing, we in the United States have inadequate testing here. So it sounds as though the cases of coronavirus in South Africa are relatively few, but the way this is affecting a large segment of the population is just by food supply and food shortages. And
yeah, I think our numbers have gone well into the 3,000s, if not 4,000.
Okay. So that's more than I understood.
Yeah, and we have, as of yesterday, we had 39 deaths, which is quite remarkable, actually,
Right.
and well over, I think, 500 recoveries of people who were diagnosed and who are now out of the red, as it were.
Yeah.
Mm.
So at this point, again, it sounds as though the issue is more how this is affecting those who have already been vulnerable, whether because of food or economic inequality or homelessness or things like that.
Yes, that's where the pressure is coming at the moment. So, for instance, and I should imagine, we're just submitting a proposal to try and mobilize civil society, and so that would be the mobilization of the religious community.
Yep.
And then we have several advice offices throughout the country, up to 500. And then there are groups of doctors and nurses that we are connected to, that some of them have offered to do diagnoses over the telephone through a huge accounting company called Gibbs. And then I happen to be the patron of a trade union for foreigners in the country, and the trade union has got well over 300-400 nurses who are also on standby to be able to help. And then through a youth entrepreneurial grouping called Harambee, more than 3 million young people can somehow be connected to what we're trying to mobilize, to sort of come alongside the government, which has included the military and the army in some of the work that they're doing, to try and provide a more systemic ownership of what is going on, instead of a kind of confrontation of people all the time.
Yeah.
Because, excuse me, to be completely honest with you, if you had to come with me into Soweto tonight, you wouldn't really think that there was a lockdown. First of all, the privilege of social distancing is just not available in the very, very busy and crowded townships. And then secondly, we're looking at people really who live from hand to mouth. And so as ideal as staying at home would be, it's almost impossible, or even though the police are out checking and that sort of thing. I mean, over one weekend, I think it was 2 weekends ago, for Easter, over 17,000 people were arrested for breaking the lockdown, as it were.
Wow.
But you arrest people, and then where do you put them?
Right.
And once they've been put into an overcrowded cell, you've almost defeated the very aim of the institution of the regulations.
Right.
And then I suppose there are 3 or 4 areas of society that are a deep concern to us. First is obviously the townships, but the secondly is the informal settlements. Where and there isn't a town or a city in this country that doesn't have attached to it a fairly substantial informal settlement. So, for instance, in one municipality in one of our provinces, there are approximately 100, well over 148 informal settlements. And informal settlements very often have very little infrastructure. So there isn't access to running water, very often no electricity except illegal connections, very little sanitation, and the rest. You know, the medical facilities are really compromised seriously. For instance, there's a sprawl in Midrand called a Leeuwenheidsbos, which is made up of formal and informal housing. At least 80,000 people. That was a figure of about 3 years ago, and 1 clinic. So you can imagine, and the clinic not equipped with any emergency facilities at all. The nearest emergency facility at least 30 kilometers away. Wow. And then your migrant communities particularly vulnerable. And your emotionally, psychologically compromised community is vulnerable, as well as your sex workers. So we've got various pockets of community. The inner city of Johannesburg is a nightmare, quite frankly, and a disaster waiting to happen if we don't try and, test and isolate much more rigorously.
So you're working with, it sounds like, an array of organizations to supplement what the government can do. So it sounds like, putting together whatever resources you have with, I don't know, whatever in civil society you can marshal in order to address these needs.
So, for instance, there's a woman in a congregation who collects food from supermarkets and hotels that is, as it were, borderline and must be consumed immediately. And that at least gives us a bit of a network to be able to empower reaching some of the hungry people for starters. It's that kind of thing that needs to be coordinated. And then if we could imagine, there are 5 directives to the intervention. And the first directive is obviously relief. So sanitizers, food, clothing, because we're now moving into the winter season. And secondly, awareness. Thirdly, care. And under care, particularly emotional care. So let me give you an illustration. With the armies moving back into the townships, the last time that happened was when we had states of emergency. And many people carry deep trauma from that experience. So there's a whole emotional component to this lockdown, besides ordinary people who are not used to being restricted in their movements. And particularly in a society that is very community conscious. So people don't just stay in their homes. There's an interconnectedness in every street and in every suburb, particularly in the Black community. And then the fourth is education and communication.
Mm-hmm.
And the fifth intervention is advocacy, which seeks to look at how do we prepare for what happens after the lockdown.
Right, right.
Particularly in terms of financial empowerment of the community and the recreation of the economy of the country.
Yeah, yeah. Paul, I'm wondering about, I mean, this is many parts of South Africa have already been so traumatized by the legacy of apartheid, by the legacy of, violence in the townships and things of that sort. What does this lockdown mean? I mean, I just imagine that it raises all sorts of past traumas, such that they're all surfacing at the same time. I mean, is that something that's going on that you're able to see? Or maybe that's too ephemeral at this point to put your finger on, but.
No, not at all. I think that, so, we've got a community out in Soweto that I'm responsible for.
Mm-hmm.
And I call them together almost on a daily basis, where because I'm responsible for the community, it's actually very important that I know what the health status of everybody is. Because if we had to have a case in Soweto, the whole community would probably need to be in isolation.
Mm-hmm.
And so I check on a sore throat, on dry coughing, on pain in the chest, on whatever it may be that could be symptoms of this very, very severe flu.
Yeah.
And what I find in the community is that people are, in a sense, more and more intolerant of each other. So there are almost silly things that irritate them and create conflict, and so there's a lot of that kind of work that's needing to happen. In terms of the country, there has been a terrible spike in the registering of abuse, particularly child abuse and gender-based violence.
Yes.
So a huge number of rapes in some of the townships, particularly. And so it's your vulnerable communities that are emotionally stressed at this stage, yes. And then quite a lot of recurring post-traumatic stress.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's a disanalogy for sure, but I can say that, that's something that's being reported on here in the United States as well. The amount of domestic violence that's increased as a result of this. Just being trapped together in a fairly confined space, it tends to bring out all kinds of stuff that may or may not have emerged prior to this. But I think the challenge in South Africa might even be all the more magnified given the very recent history of apartheid and things of that nature. So,
and the fact, that 30% of our population is, before the coronavirus, is unemployed.
Yes.
So you can imagine we have a community that is profoundly stressed economically.
Right.
So, for instance, on many, many street corners in South Africa, there are beggars asking for whatever help. Now, they have not been able to get out onto the streets and be able just for survival. So that's one of the areas that's also been very difficult.
Yes. Yep. So I'm just imagining, the 3,500 refugees that you once had in your church in Johannesburg. Where does a population like that go in a moment like this? Those who had inadequate housing, those who perhaps were homeless or were floating, in various parts of society. Where do they go in a moment like this?
Well, I mean, a lot of them have crowded into what we call the hijacked buildings in town. So many of them are in those places. Some of them have managed to get employment and pay rents. And now because they're not earning a salary, they can't pay rents. But there has been an instruction from the presidency that landowners and landlords should not evict people if they cannot pay rent. You know, so there's been some kind of attempt to intervene, but it hasn't been consistent. You know.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So buildings that are currently vacant in downtown Johannesburg are being occupied.
Yes, well, you see, part of the difficulty, I just want to move, is somebody just making a bit of a racket outside. There are, I don't think there are any vacant buildings in Johannesburg, to be frank. Yeah. So it's, I mean, that's why Johannesburg in a city is as overcrowded as it is, you know, and as vulnerable as it is. Yeah.
Okay, new location.
And then, of course, pardon?
New location now.
No, I'm back in the same place. I just needed to ask somebody right outside if they could quieten down.
Yes. I see.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk a little bit about. Well, before we move into theology, let me ask about. I mean, I know you share a border with Zimbabwe, which has been, you know, very unstable for a long time as well. What kinds of difficulties does that pose for South Africa, and what sorts of pressures are both Zimbabweans and South Africans feeling at the moment as a result of the coronavirus?
Well, of course, I mean, some people have said that of the population of 12 million Zimbabweans, there are approximately 3 million of them in South Africa. The borders are fairly tightly locked at the moment, and travel is, you know, as in the United States, it's difficult to move from one state into another. So it's difficult in South Africa to move from one province to another, unless you have some kind of immunity. And I mean, Zimbabwe they have just come out of a most dreadful food shortage. And a horrible drought. They've had an unmitigatedly hot summer. So they've come into this time very, very vulnerable. And then there has been some food relief through the World Food Organizations, but some of that stuff has been stolen and sold at profits in neighboring states. So Zimbabwe really is in a very, very vulnerable place. And then the opposition in Zimbabwe has just had a court ruling that has called into question the leadership of one of the parties. And so that part of their political scenario is very insecure and needs actually quite serious intervention to try and enable the country to cooperate in terms of the vulnerability of ordinary citizens.
Right. Wow.
And so you'd find many Zimbabweans in South Africa very, very anxious about the stability of their homes back in Zimbabwe, or their family back in Zimbabwe. And of course, one of the difficulties with this is the whole issue around death, because there are restrictions around funerals in this country. And so families are finding it very, very difficult to mourn properly.
Right.
As it were. You with me? And there's almost a culture around funerals in South Africa. You know, if you come into Soweto on a Saturday, you will see how many hundreds of people are involved in funerals every week. Now, that restriction is going to leave enormous problems for people when this disappears, because there would be a feeling that they have disrespected ancestors, that they haven't done properly with people, and so on. And, you know, in some of the hearings that I've been involved with, some of the trauma that people carry for 30 years is the fact, the guilt that they feel that they could not bury a husband or a child properly. Yeah. Because of the restrictions that were placed on them by the government at that stage.
Right, right.
And I mean,
I was just going to say, I just wonder if circling back again to the trauma, if that prior experience makes it very, very hard to trust the government in a situation like this, where there are good reasons for this kind of sequestration and lockdown, but having come through it for different reasons earlier, I would imagine it would be very, very difficult to trust that the government has one's best interest at heart.
You know, I think that our present government does enjoy trust.
Okay.
What is not trusted is authority, if that makes sense. If that makes sense to you. And I must be honest that our state president has been very appropriate.
Yeah.
If that makes sense to you. Two things have happened. First of all, the way he has spoken to the public has been compassionate, but very responsible. It hasn't carried threat and belligerence and insensitivity.
Right.
And for instance, just 2 nights ago, he asked the Department of Health to come in and to speak very specifically to the citizens of the country about the projections, and exposed all sorts of data, which was very, very important, and kind of said to the people of South Africa, we believe, number one, that you're intelligent enough to understand this stuff, and we believe that you're responsible, and we are trusting you with this information. So there hasn't been a kind of paternalistic look down at these stupid, animals in a crawl. But there has been an engagement with society that has been, I think, very mature.
Wow.
Of course, one needs to recognize that for an astute politician, you couldn't want a bigger gift, quite frankly. So there has been quite a lot of division in the ANC, which is the ruling party, until now. But this coronavirus has forced everybody in government to cooperate, whether they're on the same page with one another or not. And that has, of course, benefited politicians politically. That has not been the case in some other countries.
Well, thinking about the forthrightness and the trust with which the South African government has spoken, it makes me a little bit envious at this point. It makes me a little bit envious. We have not had that here in the United States. But that's a conversation I want to bracket for the time being. And I'm wondering if we could turn to theology at this point. I mean, you are somebody who thinks theologically and biblically, pastorally, in ways that I know I have come to deeply respect and admire. And I know our whole congregation, whenever you get into the pulpit, benefits from your wisdom. So I'm wondering where or what where your mind has gone theologically in this whole crisis. What do you make of this theologically? Is that a specific enough question to?
Yeah. Well, I think one's always got to be suspicious of people who are glib about struggle and suffering, if you know what I mean. So whatever I say, please carry along with my interpretation of the thing what your liberation theologians will call one needs to constantly be questioning oneself. There needs to be an element of suspicion about glib answers on this matter.
Of course.
Because you're dealing in some instances with people whose entire lives will never be the same.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the suffering that has been involved in people losing loved ones and the rest causes us to have a hermeneutic of suspicion around final answers, always.
Yeah.
So when one looks, for instance, at the ministry of Christ, there are instances where he acts outside of the law which he regards as binding to himself, even because he says, there's not a stroke of the pen of the law which will pass. But for instance, the law had instances where it distanced people from people with leprosy. In actual fact, people with leprosy had to, warn people that they were coming along because they were untouchable.
Right.
And so in my own conscience, there is a difficulty in reconciling physical distancing at all times.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
In this country, we have a very deep philosophy of interconnectedness. Our entire identity comes from our identity with others.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a very communal based philosophy, as it were, as opposed to a philosophy that's very individualized. So you can imagine how in this country, the other as being the possible enemy carrying the virus is very difficult to accept.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I suppose from a theological point of view, that will always be a challenge.
Yeah.
For two reasons. First of all, the responsible thing for the other person is that distance must be kept. I could be a carrier and not know it.
Mm.
And I could be the result of someone else carrying a huge amount of pain and discomfort and maybe even death because I'm flippant about my need to be close to them, if that makes sense.
Yes.
So it's a lot of this is a double bind. There isn't actually a slick answer to it.
Right.
There were some very serious Sabbath rules, for instance, around eating habits, that Jesus' disciples were confronted with. There was stuff in the law about working on the Sabbath, which had inculcated it into the law of the Jewish nation at that stage.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's a similar conflict that the true Christian community deals with. So I think that the social distancing, the dealing with illness, is very much an integral part of what Christian faith is about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We've almost delegated the responsibility of the healing to medical services.
That's right. Yeah.
But at times, some of the physical problems that we suffer from come from an emotional interaction.
That's right.
You know.
Yeah.
And I mean, the best illustration, of course, is depression. I think that there are many, many people who are going to become dysfunctional from depression, and that will have effects on their immunity and the rest. I do quite a lot of work with correctional services. And particularly at this stage, one of the correctional services down in the southern part of the country has been diagnosed as having 30 or 40 cases. Now you can imagine in a prison where social distancing is in actual fact not possible.
Right.
With people sharing cells and bathrooms and that kind of thing. And the panic in an institution like that is phenomenal.
Mm-hmm.
And where does our faith take us in bringing some kind of peace, if that's one of the expectations of faith, into that kind of context?
I think that question is profound, and I frankly don't know the answer to it at this point. Yeah, given these realities of social distancing and how it challenges every last instinct, I think not only of our faith tradition, but of our, I don't know, some of the best parts of our humanity. When things go wrong, we come together. When tragedy happens, we gather and we light candles, or we hug one another, or, you know, we find ways to be together. And, you know, even in the Gospels, we have these stories of Jesus reaching out and touching people, and the touch is what to be the healing factor. Simply receiving some kind of human connection through touch seems to possess healing power. Now, when that's no longer available, what do we have? And I worry about that. And
what is the incarnation? If it is not God reaching into our humanity,
that's right,
physically, actually,
right.
And how does one enable incarnation? Because I don't think that incarnation is something that happened historically 2,000 years ago. I mean, I think that's the essence of what the resurrection is about.
Yeah,
is that presence continues with us.
That's right.
So he says to Thomas, touch my hands, see my side. So what is the implication of incarnation in this place? And in this place at its most vulnerable?
Yes. Do you think incarnation can apply to the digital realm? I mean, do you think we have an incarnation via digital presence? Is that possible, or is that already a too limited a form?
And I suppose I want to answer the question yes and no. I mean, I think in the whole social media, we've seen in our lifetime, in our recent lifetime, a revolution.
Yeah.
In communication. So I can, for instance, sit in your study right at this very moment. I must tell you something that we did on Sunday evening on Saturday evening of Holy Week.
Yeah.
I've been able to meet with my people because there have been less than 50 of us in the room. We've respected our social distancing and all the sanitizing stuff that has been important. And traditionally in many, many churches, the Saturday night, Easter Saturday, is the night in which one remembers the dead, as it were. And so you must understand that most of the people that I was meeting with are young people. And so I spoke, first of all, about what we can expect when we lose someone and grieve. And you must know that sitting in front of me was a young boy of about, he's not so young anymore, so he's about 17. But he was first brought to me having escaped from his home being set alight by the government in Zimbabwe. Mm. And as a consequence, his brother was burned to death in the home. His mother went into hospital and eventually died. Then his father, not relating to the fire, died. And he still carries the marks of the burns on his body. Now, he was sitting right in front of me. So I said to them, if we can imagine, into this room, we bring the people that we've loved deeply, and we name them. And it was the strangest experience. There was a silence that, when we had finished sharing the names, enveloped us almost like a blanket on a cold night. It was profoundly, almost, I think, healing for some people. And I suppose, yes, to answer your question directly, social media and what we're busy with now does enable a connection which is integral to what it means to be a human being.
Well, something that you said in there struck me, and it linked to conversations I've had with you in the past. But it's your phrase when you were beginning that exercise with people. It's your phrase, "Can you imagine?" And it speaks to that. I think the power of imagination to produce a kind of healing exercise, and to produce a kind of incarnation. Where somehow those who have died come close enough to touch, if you will. But I think it's that phrase, "Can you imagine?" that I come back to again and again and again, because I think it's an integral feature to what we'll need to get ourselves through this. It's the ability to imagine. Can you imagine a world in which we no longer have the social inequalities that we currently face? Can you imagine a world in which people have food to eat? Can you imagine a world, whether it's 2 months from now or 18 months from now, who knows, when we will be able to come together again and be in close proximity with one another and, touch one another's hands and give one another hugs, things of that sort. I mean, but I think that phrase, "Can you imagine?" is so very powerful and theological. I mean, I think that's the essence of theology. Can you imagine?
I wonder whether one couldn't, one would have to be careful, whether one couldn't say faith is about how one constructs one's imagination.
Geez, yeah, I actually believe that all the way down. I believe that all the way down.
Because you see, faith does not only deal with fantasy.
That's right.
Fantasy and faith are different. Yep. I think, for instance, effective psychotherapy is about imagination.
Absolutely, yes.
Is about the way we frame, the way we understand. Now, let me just tell you one of the things that's I've been reminded about in South Africa. In South Africa, there are very few white people who don't know loneliness. There are very few black people who know loneliness. And that's why, to some degree, the virus is difficult in this context.
Yes. Yep.
And the faith framing of it. What does the writer to the Hebrews mean when she says, seeing we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, we don't give up.
I think
so there's a sense, there's a sense in which our faith is a peculiar impertinence in the face of the fact of death. If that makes sense.
An impertinence in the face of the fact of death. Yes. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. That feels exactly right. That feels exactly like Easter right there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. But of course, I mean, in a therapeutic in construction, you're wanting to invite people to make a journey away from pathology.
That's right. Right.
And a pathology which has disabled them to such an extent that they need to speak to someone else that gives them the keys to another door, or enables them to find a key to another door,
right,
to walk through.
Right.
If I'm making sense. And just to get back to your political thing, what does it mean if in faith we begin to start imagining a world where there is no poverty? Because let me say, there certainly is no excuse for the faith community for poverty. There are enough resources in this world for everybody to have enough. There are enough. But there are not enough resources in this world for people to so overindulge themselves that ultimately their humanity towards other people has no space.
Yeah, I think all of those, any movement toward human rights, any movement towards social justice, any movement towards addressing these vast social inequalities, I think always begins as an act of imagination. It always starts in the imagination, which is, I think, the connection between faith and these sorts of wider changes that we always seek, not just in the time of coronavirus. I just think that this is a moment in which we're especially invited to use our imaginations well, and to linger imaginatively over what may or could be. We know what has been. We know what could well be in a very negative sense. I also worry that we haven't been trained enough in. We're very trained in a dystopian form of thinking. We're not so well trained in how to create or imagine spaces of flourishing. I mean, where are the films about that? Where are the novels about that? I mean, I can name you a dozen films or novels right now which are about the dystopian breakdown of society. Show me the films or novels about the kind of upbuilding of a culture or society where people learn to take care of one another. We're not trained in that imagination right now. Anyway, I think for me, that's the very essence of faith. And that's what faith asks of us.
But to just pick up on what you've just said.
Yeah.
I think that obviously faith involves a pilgrimage. So one's imagination is not the end of the journey.
That's right.
It's not the destination.
That's right. Yep.
It's really not the destination. And so you can never finalize it. It is always receding and demanding the new exercise of one's mind. So, for instance, the journey of the Israelites out of Egypt. When once they were out of Egypt, they had to really move, and it took them a long time to move out of Egypt. Physically, they moved out of Egypt, but they didn't easily understand that it did mean an abandonment of idols, a new kind of expectation of their relationship with God, another sense of interrelated responsibility to one another. That wasn't immediately evident when they stepped out of that country.
Yeah.
And so too with this virus, we'll get out of this virus. I'm sure of that. But then to benefit from what this virus has got to teach us, and it's already got lessons for us. I mean, in this country, if we are not going to take very seriously the responsibility to each other, and particularly to the most vulnerable in the society, we will pay for it.
Yes, indeed.
Because it'll find a way right into our inner sanctuary.
Nope, that's exactly right. Yeah, you can't sequester this thing. So if you don't take care of the most vulnerable, it's going to come right into,
in the most horrendous way. The most horrendous way.
Yeah.
And just as you've got all sorts of professors and people who are sitting with the virus and trying to imagine its captivity. So our journey away from the virus as a humanity is going to demand some very important imagination.
Yes. I love what you say about imagination and the ways in which it can never be a static thing. It must always be dynamic. And it must always involve a continual reimagination and a renewed understanding of what life will mean, or what faith ought to mean in a different context. It reminds me of something I think Karl Barth said in the beginning of the Epistle to the Romans. He said, faith isn't about discovering some original kernel back there somewhere 2,000 years ago. Faith is always about plowing the fields today, which is to say, creating a new rut, a new cut in the earth, if you will, which will allow us to generate new life. So again, I very much resonate with the idea that it's not a one and done kind of thing. It's a continual act of reimagination. I wanted to conclude the conversation, or bring it in for a landing, by asking you about hope and where you think hope resides, if it resides anywhere right now. I think it's entirely possible that different individuals in different moments may not have hope. But I guess I wanted to open that up to you and ask you where you are on that subject.
One of the things that I think has happened because of this is that the marginalized in our communities have moved clearly onto the stage. It was Oscar Wilde who said, if the poor only had profiles, the problem of poverty would be solved.
Yes.
Now they have faces, they have names, they have the places where they live, and the struggles that they have has been exposed in a way that nobody can ignore. And I think that gives hope. As long as we come from this and we don't forget.
Yeah.
That's the first thing. The second thing is that we're inextricably in Christ. Somehow we are bound together. And I do believe that gives to us an unbreakable hope in the future. So, for instance, the reason I'm speaking to you ultimately is because of our relationship with Christ in a most mysterious way. And it's opened up it's completely diminished the distance between South Africa and America.
Right. Right. So there are ways in which that will continue to happen, I hope, inside and outside church settings, and in various parts of the whole planet. I hope that that will continue to be a feature of our learning from this whole experience, that we are all intimately connected.
Yes.
So those of us in Old Lyme, Connecticut, as a result of this conversation, but as a result of a long and fruitful partnership and friendship, have the privilege of being connected to everything that's happening in South Africa through what you're doing, Paul. So I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for all of your work in South Africa. I want to thank you for being such an incarnational presence in your neighborhood in Soweto and throughout the entire country, as you talk to people and meet with people and allow them to imagine their ways out of pain. And I want to thank you for being such a wonderful friend to our community here in Old Lyme. It matters a lot to see your face and to hear your voice, and I know a lot of people in our community will really appreciate and resonate with all that you've said today. So thank you, Paul.
And can I say thank you to you and to the community in Old Lyme? There have often been times when Old Lyme has been my place of healing, the reason for my sanity. You know, the place of my rediscovering my hope and my faith in Christ.
Well,
thank you. Thank you.
That is a powerful thing to hear. So thank you for offering that. But also, you're welcome. You're welcome.
Thank you. And you. Yeah.
Well, my hope had been to be able to visit you in South Africa at some point in 2020. I suspect that is going to be complicated by the virus, but we shall see. We shall see. Perhaps it'll be 2021, but the time will come. In the meantime, know that our prayers are with you in South Africa, and know that our prayers are with all the people that you are in ministry with there. So thanks for being a part of this.
And you are in our prayers here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Especially with the leadership you have in your country.
We are challenged in that particular way. All right. Well, on that hopeful note, I want to bring the conversation to a close and just say to all of you out there who may have been watching, thank you for watching. And I hope that you're well. I hope that you're taking care of yourselves. I hope that you're figuring out ways to get out, to move. I hope that you are staying connected in whatever way you can, through phone calls, through emails, through whatever mechanisms you have available to you. Do stay connected. And know that I love you, know that we love you, and know that we're going to get through this. All right. Love in the time of Corona. We'll see you next time. Bye.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you.
Right. Thanks, Paul.
Bye-bye.
Bye.